Hello, my name is Paige. My second favorite thing about being in the military was not having to fret over what to wear to work. Despite the uniformity goals of the military, I learned through my time as a weather forecaster that differences make the world go round. My favorite thing about my experience in the military is how one instantly becomes a part of a community with people from all walks of life, from all around the globe. For one reason or another, we are all here. And for the most part, we are going to help each other get through this. When I say I'm a deeply spiritual person, please understand that deciding to join the United States Air Force was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. I have long considered myself a spiritual warrior. My journey through life has been a bit of a wild nature trail full of zigs and zags, following inspiration to go and be a light in this world. However, I never imagined myself joining the military. It was one of those life situations where all doors close, but one clings wide open. When I say all walks of life, that has a double edge to it. Set against the backdrop of being trained to be soldiers first and learning how to hurry up and wait, one has the opportunity to look at their own qualms with war, peace, violence, being a contributing citizen, and passivity. It is not always a pretty picture. I was going round and round. Then there was a moment of clarity when I realized I am here. I'm going to make the most of it and show up and be a light. I learned how to face my own darkness, befriend it, and realize that darkness nor light is good or evil. They are two parts of a whole. When I can use the guidance of centered loving kindness, my own beautiful darkness sets the backdrop for my light to radiate out into this great universe. It is my hope that this energetic output transmutes as care, joy, love, peace, patience, goodness, gentleness, self-control, kindness, and hope renewed. This is how I choose to be a spiritual warrior these days. At least that's my goal, for I am still a very messy, learning human being. I would like to take a moment to lift up our ancestors who helped pave the way to the freedom we do experience today. For those who we remember today that have fallen in the tragedies of war and pursuit of peace. I am so grateful to be a part of this beautiful, dramatically diverse, yet connected community. May we be lamps unto each other. Blessings to you and yours.
We're all affected by events that occur in our lifetimes. I was 17 when I attended my first demonstration against the Vietnam War. It was a war that touched the lives of an entire generation while reshaping the Department of Defense and national policy. The military draft still existed. Young men could be called up and sent to fight in Vietnam without their permission. This was an unpopular war, which seemed to be a conflict between North and South Vietnam. It made a little sense to U.S. forces to be sent to Vietnam to, quote, fight for your country. Approximately 58,000 military died in combat, 1,500 are still not accounted for. The Vietnam era was approximately 20 years. It was a forever war whose goals were not well defined. One of the saddest parts of the Vietnam War was, unlike the celebrations for World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans often returned to a country deeply divided and sometimes hostile. People did not separate their dislike of the war from the veterans who served, many of whom had no choice about being sent to Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords were signed by the United States January 27, 1973, ending the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. On that same day, the draft of young men into the U.S. military officially ended. The U.S. now had to operate with an all-voluntary military force, which continues to this day. 2 years after the peace accords were signed, the South Vietnamese government unconditionally surrendered, and the reunification of North and South Vietnam began. Demonstrating against a war I did not believe in, and the history of our involvement in Vietnam set the stage for a decision I never expected to make. However, I will say for another time how I happened to join that all-voluntary military force. But 7 years later, I was an ensign in the Navy stationed in Washington, D.C. Because of the hostility toward Vietnam veterans, in D.C., we wore uniforms only once a month. We were to just blend in with the general population and not draw attention. The biggest engagement while I was on active duty was Desert Storm, a war that lasted 43 days with our allies, and the purpose was to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. When that was done, the war ended. The lessons learned from Vietnam carried through the 23 years I was on active duty. Have a well-defined mission and stop when that mission is complete. I essentially served in a peacetime military because of the lessons learned from Vietnam. I retired as a captain, Navy captain, August 1st, 2001. 42 days later, 9/11 occurred. Amid the shock and grief, the lessons learned in Vietnam seemed to be forgotten. We were once again in a 20-year war with no well-defined purpose. This time, at least the veterans were appreciated. In the years after my retirement, I started hearing, "Thank you for your service," something I don't remember ever hearing while I was on active duty. Those who serve today do deserve to hear that. There is an idealism trained into our military: duty, honor, service. The backbone of integrity and political neutrality are essential for this country to maintain our democracy. The knowledge, camaraderie, travel, adventures, and responsibility of my active duty days shape me and will always be part of who I am. And when my days have ended, I intend to join my fellow veterans on the shores of the Potomac at Arlington National Cemetery to be part of future Memorial Days.
Well, good morning to you all. I'm David Whitkey, despite the absence of a name tag, which I didn't put on because I was afraid it would cover up my red poppy lapel pin, which is appropriate for this morning. Whenever I'm asked to speak about my naval service or about Memorial Day or about war and peace, I frankly feel a little bit of an imposter, a little bit of a fraud, because despite the fact that I served 9 years in the U.S. Navy, I never encountered any battle conditions. I was fortunate. My 9 years in the service fell, for me, fortunately, immediately between the cool down of the Korean War and U.S. entry into the Vietnam War. So although I heard of war and trained for war, I never actually experienced war. And frankly, I'm grateful for that. But I do have significant memories of my time in the service that are related to Memorial Day and to war and peace. And before that, I have significant memories about my childhood memories and experiences. See, I was born in 1937. That was before the U.S. entry into World War II. And so much of my childhood was spent during semi-peacetime. For me, Memorial Day, which in those days we called Decoration Day, was a time of family reunions. All of my mother's family, scattered households all over southwest Iowa, gathered on Memorial Day at my grandmother's house in Glenwood to have a picnic, to reunion, to reminisce, to go to the graveyards and decorate the graves with pretty flowers, and stand around and reminisce about the people who were dead and how they had fit into the family and who they were. And then we would all go back home. Then one year, when I must have been about 9, my older brother then would have been about 12 or 13, we got home, and my older brother Roger said to my mother, "Mom, why were those soldiers there in the graveyard firing their guns?" And my mother, who had been a school teacher before she got married and always tried to seize teaching moments, said, "Well, Roger, you know, those soldiers and their gunfire were in honor of soldiers who have died in wartime and whom we are gathered this day to memorialize. And they're there specifically this year because the United States has just entered into the war in Europe. And so it has additional and significant meaning for us." She said, "I think it's important that you know about the wars." She said, "So I want to tell you about I want to tell you about the Great War. During the Great War, there were a series of major battles fought in Europe in a place called Flanders. Flanders was a swampy and meadow area in Belgium between France and Germany. And on one side was the German army advancing, and on the other side were the English, the French, the Belgians, and eventually the Americans trying to defend Europe. There were a series of 5 major battles fought in that area of Flanders. In one of those battles alone, the biggest of the battles, there were over, counting both sides, there were over 850,000 casualties. Excuse me. The mere immensity of that causes me to choke up a little. She said, and during those battles, there was a young poet who was in the battles, and in one of the battles, the soldiers on both sides of him got blown away. They were his friends. And so the next day, while the battle was raging, the next day during a pause in the battle, he sat down and wrote a poem about the war. That poem became the symbol of war for years after, and it's where the idea of the red poppy comes from, that the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion sell at this time of, distribute at this time of year, still to this very day. She said, "I want to read you this poem by this poet, because I think it's a good education for you and may make an impression on your mind. Well, it did make an impression on my mind, as you can tell, because I still remember it. And if I choke up a little while reading it, part of it's due to the poem, and part of it is due to my memories of my mom reading it to us boys. But here it goes. In Flanders fields, red poppies blow between white crosses, row on row. The crosses mark our place, while in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarcely heard amid the guns roaring below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders fields. To you who live, we pass the torch of freedom. Be yours to hold it on high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. And that's the origin of the red poppies that people wear in their lapels these days to memorialize fallen soldiers. Later, when I was actually in the Navy, although I experienced no wartime, I served with shipmates and friends who did. I had friends and shipmates, yes, page of all descriptions and all levels and all neighborhoods. I had friends and shipmates who had lost friends during the Korean War, during amphibious landings, and while being bombarded. And I had shipmates who, after I left the Navy, died in Vietnam as their craft sailed up the Mekong River, taking fire from the Viet Cong on both sides of the river. So I didn't experience that, but I heard tales about it both while I was in and heard the news of it after I was out. Still later, I have significant memories of Memorial Day that were generated here in this church. One was John Isom's sermon that you heard read. And then there was Roy McKay, a longtime member here, who was among those who landed on Omaha Beach during the assault, during World War II. And he told how his landing vessel left my ship. It wasn't my ship, but it was the kind of ship I would have been serving on. Left the ship into the smaller craft, went ashore to the beach in waves of troops, who, as soon as they got onto the beach, came under heavy fire from the German fortifications along the ridge above the beach. The fire was so intense that the American and English troops could not advance. They simply dug in on the beach. And when I say dug in, they didn't have time to dig trenches. Roy explained how he dug a narrow, shallow depression, just low enough for him to lie in, and so he could occasionally raise his head up to see what was going on. 3 days he lay in that position, wondering if he would ever move again, before the offshore bombardments and the Allied bombs drove the Germans away from the ridge so that the troops could advance up into Europe. And I remember when Roy made this presentation, he had put on his Army Browns, and he got into them still. He still fit them. None of us older guys could imagine fitting into our World War II uniforms. And then a few years later, there was the story of Caesar Smith. Caesar Smith was a member of our congregation who, during Vietnam, demonstrated a different kind of courage. He was a platoon leader in the jungle in Vietnam. They had fought their way through the jungle and reached the base of a steep hill that was rocky, heavily enforced by the Viet Cong. He was vastly outnumbered. They reached the base of this hill, and he got the message over the radio, a command over the radio, from his commanding officer back at headquarters: take that hill. He replied, are there any other forces in the area that can help us take that hill? Because I have only half my platoon left. And the order came back, Lieutenant, take that hill. Well, Roy knew it was a suicide mission. He turned off the radio. He turned to his men and he said, troops, we're headed back to headquarters. And they did. That's a different kind of courage, the kind that also needs to be shown in battle and in wartime. A third experience in this congregation was I came to a Progressive Voices concert a few years ago, and there was a folk singer named Joe Jenks, an older guy with a beard and played the guitar and had a voice that was even more gravelly than mine. But he introduced us to a song called And the Band Played Waltzing Matilda. Not Waltzing Matilda, but And the Band Played Waltzing Matilda. And he told us the story that went with it. The Australians decided to join World War II and asked for volunteers. Hundreds of young Australian men came into headquarters and signed up and trained. And as they were put on the ships to head for Europe, the band played Waltzing Matilda amid celebration and cheering and all sorts of hero messages to the brave young soldiers who were going off to war. The band played Waltzing Matilda. Several years later, after this unit had been butchered in Italy, what was left of those troops came back on separate ships in straggles, one or two at a time, many of them injured, many of them wounded, many of them just shell-shocked, and landed in Australia and went to their homes virtually unnoticed. Then, years later, Joe Jenks told us, 50 years later, Australia was celebrating its entrance into World War II, or rather the end of World War II. And there was a big parade, and the young soldiers marched, and the bands played, and in the middle of it all came along this small group of ragged old guys, some of them in wheelchairs, some of them on canes, some of them standing still proudly erect, walking slowly, no music, just walking. And one of the young men that was overheard by the guy who wrote the song, one of the young men on the sidelines, one in the audience, turned to his fellows and said, "Who are these old guys? And why are they marching in our parade and holding up the rest of the floats?" So the fellow that overheard that, a man named Eric Bogle, went home and wrote this folk song called "And the Band Played Waltzing Matilda," which the end of that parade, there were young women with pom-poms and twirling batons prancing down the street, followed by a parade of young soldiers. And that's when the band played Waltzing Matilda. The irony of it just struck, and the tragedy of it struck Jenks, and he wrote, Bogle, and he wrote that song, that Joe Jenks sang for us here that day. And I've always remembered that song. So you can see I have memories of Memorial Day, even though I never experienced battle. But I've witnessed and heard about the tragedies and the honor we should pay to those who died or were seriously wounded and died later of their injuries, which, by the way, is what happened to the young poet who wrote Flanders Fields. He died a few days later of an injury he had sustained in the battle. So I have a suggestion for you, for all of us. If we want to get a deeper understanding of what Memorial Day is all about, go home, sign on to YouTube, call up "And the Band Played Waltzing Matilda," and play that song. And then call your kids together and read them. "In Flanders Fields, red poppies grow." Thank you, and over to Barbara.